Narcissistic abuse is one of the most misunderstood psychological phenomena in modern discourse, often diluted by oversimplified explanations, social media buzzwords, and self-diagnosed interpretations that obscure its true complexity. While many people casually label difficult individuals as narcissists, the clinical reality is far more precise, rare, and profoundly disturbing. Understanding why narcissists abuse is not simply about identifying toxic behaviors. It requires examining the underlying psychological structure that make abuse not optional, but inevitable within narcissistic dynamics. This is where the concept becomes both unsettling and illuminating. Narcissistic abuse is not a series of bad choices. It is a structural necessity embedded in the narcissist's psychological functioning. At the core of pathological narcissism lies a paradox. Narcissists present themselves as self-sufficient, independent, superior, and emotionally detached, yet beneath this facade exists an extreme dependency on others. This dependency is not ordinary. It is compulsive, addictive, and fundamental to their psychological survival. Narcissists rely on what is often referred to as narcissistic supply, which includes attention, admiration, validation, and emotional reactions from others. Without this supply, the narcissist experiences a collapse of their internal stability. Therefore, their interactions with others are not based on mutuality or connection, but on extraction. People are not partners, friends, or equals. They are resources. This dynamic fundamentally alters how narcissists perceive reality. Unlike healthy individuals who recognize others as separate, autonomous beings with their own thoughts and emotions, narcissists struggle to perceive others as external entities. Instead, they experience people as internal objects, extensions of their own mind. This is not metaphorical, it is a clinical feature. Because of this, every relationship the narcissist engages in follows the same rigid template, often referred to as a shared fantasy. This shared fantasy is not a mutual creation, but a psychological construct imposed by the narcissist, designed to regulate their internal instability. The shared fantasy begins with what many recognize as the love bombing phase. During this stage, the narcissist idealizes the target, projecting exaggerated admiration, intense emotional connection, and rapid escalation of intimacy. The target may feel uniquely seen, valued, and understood. However, this experience is deceptive, not because the narcissist is consciously manipulating, but because they are interacting with an internalized version of the person, not the real individual. The admiration is directed at a constructed image, not at the authentic self of the partner. This creates an early distortion that becomes more apparent over time. As the relationship progresses, the shared fantasy evolves into devaluation. The same person who was once idealized becomes criticized, diminished, or emotionally neglected. This shift is not caused by anything the victim does. It reflects the narcissist's internal dynamics. Because the narcissist cannot maintain stable perceptions of others, they oscillate between extremes, idealization and devaluation. These shifts are experienced by the victim as betrayal, confusion, and emotional instability. Importantly, this betrayal operates on multiple levels. It is not only the obvious betrayals, such as infidelity or rejection, but also a deeper, existential betrayal. The realization that the narcissist has never engaged with the real person at all. One of the most damaging aspects of narcissistic abuse is its impact on the victim's perception of reality. Over time, victims begin to doubt their own thoughts, feelings, and interpretations. This is not always the result of deliberate gaslighting, as commonly believed. In fact, narcissists often believe their own distorted perceptions. They are not intentionally deceiving. They are operating within a delusional framework where fantasy and reality are blurred. When a narcissist insists on a version of events that contradicts reality, they are not necessarily lying. They are expressing their subjective truth, which is disconnected from objective reality. This creates a destabilizing effect on the victim, who struggles to reconcile conflicting narratives. The result is what can be described as an epistemic crisis. The victim loses confidence in their ability to understand the world, interpret behavior, and make decisions. Fundamental psychological tools, such as theory of mind and internal working models of relationships, begin to deteriorate. Theory of mind allows individuals to understand that others have independent thoughts and feelings, while internal working models help predict how relationships function. When these systems are disrupted, the victim becomes disoriented, uncertain, and increasingly dependent on the narcissist for guidance and validation. This dependency reinforces the shared fantasy and makes it more difficult to exit the relationship. Another critical dimension of narcissistic abuse is emotional regulation. Healthy individuals regulate their emotions internally, using coping mechanisms to manage stress, anxiety, and mood fluctuations. Narcissists, however, lack this capacity. They rely on external regulation, meaning they depend on others to stabilize their emotional state. This places an enormous burden on the victim, who becomes responsible for managing the narcissist's feelings. The victim may find themselves constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering anger, withdrawal, or criticism. Over time, this leads to exhaustion, anxiety, and a loss of personal identity. The concept of identity erosion is central to understanding the long-term effects of narcissistic abuse. Victims often report feeling like they are no longer themselves, as if their identity has been replaced or hollowed out. This phenomenon is linked to processes such as introjection and projective identification, where the narcissist transfers aspects of their internal world onto the victim. The victim begins to internalize the narcissist's emotions, beliefs, and distortions, leading to confusion and self-alienation. This is not a superficial change. It affects the core sense of self. In addition to identity erosion, narcissistic abuse often results in a range of psychological symptoms, including depression, anxiety, dissociation, and in some cases, brief psychotic episodes. These effects are not comparable to typical relationship distress. They represent a deeper level of psychological disruption, sometimes described as complex trauma, unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, which is associated with acute life-threatening events. Complex trauma develops over prolonged exposure to harmful dynamics. It is characterized by chronic emotional distress, impaired self-concept, and difficulties in relationships. One of the reasons narcissistic abuse is so difficult to recognize and validate is that it often lacks clear, observable evidence. Much of the dynamic occurs at a psychological level, making it hard to articulate or prove. Victims may struggle to explain their experiences to others, leading to what is known as epistemic injustice. They know something is wrong, but they are not believed or understood. This lack of validation can compound the trauma, creating a sense of isolation and self-doubt. It is also important to address common misconceptions about narcissists and their victims. Contrary to popular belief, victims are not specifically chosen for their empathy, kindness, or special qualities. The idea that narcissists target certain types of people is largely a myth. In reality, narcissists are opportunistic. They seek individuals who can provide the resources they need, whether that is emotional support, admiration, or practical benefits. The relationship is fundamentally transactional, even if it appears romantic or meaningful on the surface. Similarly, Not all individuals with narcissistic traits are clinical narcissists. Narcissistic personality disorder is relatively rare, affecting a small percentage of the population. However, narcissistic traits such as self-centeredness, entitlement, and lack of empathy are more common and can still create harmful dynamics. Distinguishing between these categories is crucial for accurate understanding and appropriate responses. Another area of confusion involves the perception of narcissists as master manipulators. While some narcissistic behaviors may appear calculated, much of what they do is driven by unconscious processes. They are not always strategically planning their actions. They are reacting to internal needs and deficits. This does not make their behavior less harmful, but it challenges the notion that they are fully aware and intentional in their abuse. Sexuality within narcissistic relationships also reflects these underlying dynamics. Rather than being driven by genuine attraction to others, narcissistic sexuality is often self-focused. The partner becomes a means through which the narcissist experiences their own desirability and validation. This can result in patterns of hypersexuality, or in some cases, avoidance of sex altogether. In both scenarios, the focus remains on the narcissist's needs rather than mutual intimacy. Ultimately, the question of why narcissists must abuse can be answered by examining the structure of their psychological functioning. Abuse is not a deviation from their behavior. It is a consequence of how they relate to others. Because they cannot perceive others as independent individuals, because they depend on external regulation, and because they operate within a distorted reality, their interactions inevitably become exploitative and damaging. The shared fantasy requires control, and control requires the suppression or transformation of the other person. For victims, understanding this dynamic is a critical step toward recovery. It shifts the narrative from personal failure or inadequacy to structural inevitability. The abuse was not caused by something the victim did or failed to do. It was embedded in the nature of the relationship from the beginning. This realization can be both painful and liberating. It challenges deeply held beliefs about love, trust, and self-worth, but it also opens the possibility for healing and rebuilding. Recovery from narcissistic abuse involves more than leaving the relationship. It requires reconstructing one's sense of reality, identity, and autonomy. This process can be complex and time-consuming, often involving therapy, self-reflection, and the gradual re-establishment of trust in oneself and others. It also involves recognizing and addressing the patterns that allowed the relationship to develop and persist, not as a form of self-blame, but as a means of growth and prevention. In a broader context, the increasing awareness of narcissism in popular culture presents both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it brings attention to important issues and validates the experiences of many individuals. On the other hand, it risks oversimplification and misuse of terminology, which can dilute the concept and create confusion. Accurate understanding requires careful differentiation between clinical conditions, personality traits, and everyday behaviors. In conclusion, narcissistic abuse is not simply about toxic individuals or unhealthy relationships. It is a complex psychological phenomenon rooted in the structure of narcissistic personality. The abuse is not incidental. It is integral to how narcissists interact with the world. Recognizing this reality is essential for both understanding and recovery. By moving beyond myths and misconceptions, it becomes possible to see the dynamics more clearly and take meaningful steps toward healing and resilience.